Hey folks, how you all doing? So today I'm going to be doing a rankings video of the 9 studio albums by New Zealand band Split Enz. I'll be just showing my CDs in this collection because all my vinyl's still boxed away except for this one. But I'll show you this one because this is the laser etched version from 1980 of True Colours. Just thought I'd show that one. At that time in the world, there was only 2 laser etched albums apparently. You had this one and you had the Superman soundtrack, the one with Christopher Reeve and Marlon Brando. But yeah, there were 6 or 7 different colour variations of the cover art on that particular album. But that's enough of that. We're not dealing with that album. We're dealing with Split Enz. So Split Enz were a New Zealand band formed in the early 1970s by Tim Finn. By 1977, younger brother Neil Finn had left school and was allowed to join the band, and the rest is history. You guys all know the name Neil Finn from Crowded House, I guess, more than Split Enz. But let's get into the rankings video. There's no right or wrong with rankings videos. It's just my personal opinion on how I perceive these albums after listening to them all. You know, yours may be perfectly different to mine, upside down, back to front, doesn't matter. It's how you enjoy it that matters and what you enjoy. So off we go. At number 9, I have their 9th and final studio album, See You Around. This was released in 1984. I think the title says it all, See You Around. Neil Finn knew it was time to go. This was the first Split Enz album that Tim Finn did not appear on in any way, shape or form. This was Neil's basically, you know, getting thrown in the deep end to produce the album, write it all, and basically be in charge. I think it suffers slightly. I think he was maybe, I'm not saying consciously, but most definitely subconsciously overwhelmed with the pressures and responsibilities that would come with being in charge of a full album. Now that's not put down Neil. It's the first time he was doing it. He was still fairly, you know, a young kid. He was only in his early 20s and he was thrown into the limelight on his own after being in quite possibly the biggest New Zealand band. Well, they were the biggest New Zealand band of all time. And, you know, always receiving Grammy Awards in Australia, the Australian Music Awards anyway, year in, year out. So there was a lot of pressure on Neil. Sort of like, I think he missed working with Tim. Just like McCartney missed working with Lennon, Lennon missed working with McCartney, etc. in those first couple of years, and I think this was the same here. But it was a good lesson for him. He learnt very, very quickly that there's nothing bad on this album. It's just it's an average album. A lot of the songs are still quite catchy, but there's really not much on here that's memorable for me. It's just a pleasant album. This one comes in at 6 out of 10. At number 8 on my list, I have Dysrhythmia. This was their 3rd album. It was released in 1977. This was the first album that Neil Finn actually became a member of the band. The band also seemed to, at this time, after their first 2 albums, take a musical, turned their music on their head. They become more 3-minute pop orientated, new wave orientated, catchy pop writers as opposed to art rock, prog rock, etc. So I think he did add a lot to the band and took them in other directions, and Tim was happy to oblige and keep going in those directions. Best song for me on here is My Mistake, followed by the brilliant Charlie. This one does come in at a 6.5 out of 10. At number 7 on the list, I have their 2nd album called Second Thoughts. This was released in 1976. I say it's a bit of a mishmash of songs. It is and it isn't. There's several songs on here that have been re-recorded from their debut album because this was their first international release. So they re-recorded them for the international universal market as opposed to the Australian New Zealand market. I get that. Sometimes artists do that when they progress from being a band in a small economy through to the world economy. I get why they do that. It all comes down to logistics and money and promotion, etc. Those songs on here are quite good, but they're not as good as the originals on the original album. There are 3 original tracks written for this album: Sweet Dreams, The Woman Who Loves You, and the brilliant Late Last Night. I'd like to say it's a top-notch album, but it's not, because of the fact that there are re-recorded, like, cover versions of their own songs. This cannot go any higher in my list, but it still comes in at 7 out of 10. Number 6 on my list, I have their 6th studio album, Waiata. I think that's how you pronounce it. That's what it was called in New Zealand and the rest of the world. Waiata. That's a New Zealand Indigenous Maori word for home or welcome or get together. The Australian Indigenous word for that is corroboree. So out in Australia they called the album Corroboree. It just has Waiata across the top instead of corroboree on the rest of the world's album covers. Same cover art and everything, it's just the title has changed. Some new wave sounds on here, and some regular 3-minute catchy pop. This is an improvement in songwriting, and you find that when you listen to their albums from the first album through, that the songs do pretty much get better and better, except for that last album, See You Around. They do get better with each album. The songwriting gets better, the musicianship is better, and the production gets slightly better. So yeah, they're starting to sing more with personal issues on this album. Tim was getting a bit more darker with his songs, simply because he was feeling the pressures of the international success and attention they were starting to get. He felt a big weight on his shoulders being his band, and he started to turn to prescription medication, alcohol, and it did start to take an effect on him at times, but he still managed to kick on for another album after this. Pardon me. Best track on here is the main hit, History Never Repeats, which is a great song, and it sums up the vibe of the album. This comes in at 7.5 out of 10. At number 5 on my list, I have Time and Tide. This was their 7th album. This was released in 1982. A lot of Tim Finn's songs on here are very dark and somber. They're very introverted. They're dealing with the depression he was feeling and the breakdown that he'd had over the previous year to 18 months. So he was coming out of it. He was now writing about it, especially in a song like Dirty Creature. You also had the uplifting 6 Months in a Leaky Boat, Pioneer song, which was really good. But of course, if you read between the lines, that's also about his depression. But they were the 2 really hit singles off here. So Neil's writing some really upbeat, up-tempo type songs, which sort of counterbalances the deep, dark, somber feel of Tim's songs, much like Paul McCartney did with John's songs in the Beatles. You had the deep, dark, serious John, you had the light, poppy Paul. So these guys were doing the same thing. This one comes in at an excellent 8 out of 10. Mind you, I do have to be in the mood to listen to this album at times, just because it is so dark. Number 4 on my list, we have True Colours. This was their 5th studio album, released in 1980. This was the one that sort of got international attention with the hit I Got You. It's new wave, it's post-punk, it's 3-minute catchy radio friendly pop songs. There's 2 instrumentals on here, both of which I like, and I'm not a fan of instrumentals. It's tightly played and written. Neil Finn really got his mojo going with this for sure. But yeah, he's still not getting as many songs on the albums as Tim did, but that's fine. He's gradually learning his craft. Even back in the day, Paul McCartney heaped a lot of praise on this album and on the Finn brothers as songwriters, and you can understand why when you listen to this album. Album comes in at 8 out of 10 for me. Number 3 on my list, I have their debut album, Mental Notes. This was released in 1975. This is full of art rock. It's full of prog rock, almost avant-garde in places as well. When you listen to this, you can actually, in some places like Under the Wheel, for example, you can actually hear sort of a lot of Jethro Tull type influences in the prog rock parts of this. It's a huge distance from where they were going to get, you know, art rock, prog rock, right the way through to what they ended up becoming, just pure pop radio friendly songs. So this is a long way from where they were. It's really worth a listen though if you want to see where Split Enz actually started. Their live shows at this time were also full of a lot of theatre, theatrics, mime, and general absurdness. And you can see that with the caricatures on the album cover. Absolutely brilliant album. Once you get into it, you can't not get into it any further. It's just there. Once you get it, you get it, if you know what I mean. 8.5 out of 10. Number 2 from me is an album that does get slagged off quite a lot. Not slagged off, but doesn't get as much love as it should, in my opinion. Conflicting Emotions. This was their 8th studio album. It was released in 1983 originally. Tim Finn had all but left the band. I think he plays on a couple of these tracks, 2 or 3 maybe, and sings on a couple of them as well. Conflicting Emotions probably sums up the album in a lot of ways. You know, Tim was leaving, there have been a lot of emotions flying around, Neil wondering what he was going to do without Tim, I guess, to an extent. The band wondering if they could survive without Tim Finn being their founder and leader. The final track, Bon Voyage, is actually Tim's last song with the band, and that just about sums it up as well. It was a goodbye to the band and the fans as a member of Split Enz. He ended up with a pretty half-decent solo career up until the early 90s when he went back to Crowded House for one album, Woodface. The album does actually have more in common with Crowded House than Split Enz. You could see the direction that Neil Finn was going to take, and he was taking it with his songwriting. So even though it's a Split Enz album, it's got a feel of Crowded House about it, and I think that's why this one is really high on my list. It also has a bit of a feel like the Finn brothers' first album, Finn, as well, sort of quirkiness but offbeat stuff, if you get my drift. But yeah, it's a really, really good album. It's a good bridging album between Split Enz and Crowded House. 9 out of 10. And my favourite Split Enz album of all time is their 4th studio album. This was released in 1979, called Frenzy. To me, this is the greatest new wave album ever, and that's a big call to say that about new wave. I really love new wave, but to call something the greatest new wave album of all time, that's pretty high call, and I think this one does do it. You got the raunchy, almost punky feel of I See Red. You've got the piano ballad of Stuff and Nonsense, and then you've got the quirky sort of Oblad D type stuff and Paul McCartney's bogey music type stuff of Hermit McDermott, and all these influences and things are all rolled into one superb new wave album. But I say that, but this was released a year before Paul McCartney's McCartney 2 with bogey music, and Hermit McDermott has got the same feel as that. If you get it, it's a bit madnessy as well, like Benny Bullfrog off their 7 album. It's got that sort of vibe as well. But yeah, this is an absolute new wave classic. If you're into new wave and haven't heard this album, it's well worth this album. And it's all typical of the Split Enz sounds that you know and possibly love. I hope you love, because you're watching this video. Yeah, it's a 9 out of 10 for me. Anyway, guys, that's my ranking of the 9 studio albums by New Zealand band Split Enz. So yeah, just leave your comments in the comments section below. What are your rankings? What do you think of Split Enz? Do you prefer them at Crowded House, etc, etc? Anyway, guys, thanks for watching. Stay safe, take care. All for now. Catch you around, and bye, folks.